Inducible responses are defense responses that happen after attack or injury. Obviously, these are in contrast to constitutive or preformed defenses that are always there. Inducible responses usually or often involved upregulation of genes or changes in gene transcription that results in proteins being produced that cause these responses. Some of these responses can happen in minutes to hours, whereas some of them are longer term. This picture here is sort of an extreme example of an induced response. This is resin flow in loblolly pine in response to wounding plus application of methyl jasmonate, which is a synthetic form of a stress hormone. With just the wounding, you would still see some resin exudation, but it wouldn't be as extreme as in response to this artificial wound hormone. And for instance, when trees were wounded in the process of resin production for naval stores, they would often wound and then spray the wound with, for instance, acid to stimulate that induced response of resin production. So one of the first responses that we see, especially in pines and some other conifers, that is inducible is upregulation of resin production and also production of traumatic resin ducts. So here's an example of traumatic resin ducts. So certainly there are constitutive resin ducts in pines, but there also are induced production of traumatic resin ducts, which is just new resin ducts that are produced by the vascular cambium in the sapwood, where xylem mother cells that would normally be used to produce tracheids produce resin ducts instead. So this is sort of a medium-term response that allows the production of additional resin that's induced from pest or pathogen attack. So that's an important response to, or induced response in especially conifers. Another induced response that can be important is production of wound paraderm. Where paraderm is essentially, outer bark that's produced by a cork cambium. So this is an example. This is one of my favorite wounded tree pictures where tree had a horrific wound and they put bricks in it. This is like old school arboriculture. They don't do this kind of thing anymore, but you can see around this wound essentially what looks like bark along these edges, and that's wound paraderm. This close-up here shows again a traumatic wound in a pine, and here this is new paraderm being produced along the edges of that wound. And this arrow shows the curving of the cambium inward, and that vascular cambium will actually gradually grow across that wound. It might take years, but those are examples of induced responses to wounding in pine. In addition to those induced responses, I want to remind you that There are cells in the secondary phloem called polyphenolic parenchyma cells, and that's these cells here. All of this is the phloem. So we're looking at a block of stem here, where this is the outer bark or the paraderm out here. This is the phloem. Here's the vascular cambium, and here's the xylem. So these polyphenolic parenchyma cells exist in the secondary phloem, but they're activated, they're preformed, those are constitutive and have some polyphenols in them, but after attack by pests, pathogens, or wounding, those are basically upregulated to produce additional phenolic chemicals, and these cells will actually swell in response to wounding or pathogen attack. So these will swell as an induced response. So essentially those PP or polyphenolic parenchyma cells will swell as an induced response and provide an additional barrier and produce additional polyphenols, which are poisonous to pathogens or herbivores. So that's another example of an induced response. So all of those things are examples of induced responses. In all of those cases, those are sort of preformed or existing structures, but their expression or sort of size can change in response to induction as an induced response. Just another view in cross-section of conifer xylem and phloem here. So this is conifer xylem here. This is the vascular cambium, and this is phloem. So we can see these polyphenolic parenchyma cells really swollen up and essentially forming a complete barrier in the phloem. This is after wounding. And also these traumatic resin ducts that have been produced by the vascular cambium. These are all new. These are also traumatic resin ducts. So example of structural induced responses to trauma. Acquired resistance is another concept that you can think of as an induced response. And acquired resistance is just when the response, the induced response to an initial pathogen attack or wounding, or both, results in increased resistance to subsequent attacks. Okay, so that's acquired resistance. And this is graphs are an example of acquired resistance in Norway spruce, where they had some controls, and then they had pre-treated trees that were pre-treated by wounding them and inoculating them with a fungus. And then they waited some period of time and then inoculated them all. Okay, so this is the response to that second inoculation. And what you can see is that in that second inoculation, in the first inoculation, the control trees didn't have anything done to them. The pre-treated trees had an initial inoculation. But what you can see is in that second inoculation, where even the control trees were inoculated, those control trees fared much worse, where they had much higher percent of their tissue infected by that blue stained fungus, much higher percentage of dead cambium, and much greater length of necrosis or dead tissue. And this was likely due to a greater prevalence of resin ducts in those pre-treated trees. So those additional resin ducts provided additional resistance to that second inoculation event. And you can imagine this being adaptive, where an initial attack sort of revs up or induces defense responses that then enable that tree to be better resistant to subsequent attacks. So clearly that's an adaptive response. But this is a nice demonstration. And in fact, this Christensen et al. Paper was the first demonstration of acquired resistance, I believe, in conifers to fungus. So it's a nice example.